There's a story powerful nations tell themselves at the height of their success. We're different. We're smarter. We've learned what the last empire didn't. The uniforms change, the flags change, the math does not. Across 2,000 years, the world's dominant powers have traced a familiar arc. Overreach, deficits, changes to the money, rising prices, a slow break in trust, and then a step down in status. The mechanics differ. The order rhymes. Today, I'm going to walk you through that sequence with 3 giant case studies, Rome, Spain, and Britain, and then we'll score where the United States sits right now. No doom for clicks, just a clear map you can use to understand what is happening and what tends to happen next. Let's start at the beginning of the cycle. Stage 1, dominance. When an empire rises to the top, its money is more than a medium of exchange. It's a promise that travels safely across distance and time. Rome stamped its promise into silver. The denarius, first struck around 201 BC, was a coin you could trust from the forests of northern Europe to the markets of Egypt. For generations, the Roman state kept its quality high. A denarius was a known weight of precious metal, and that simple fact made roads, aqueducts, armies, and law all easier to build and maintain. Soldiers took their pay without complaint. Merchants settled trade without haggling over the coin itself. The money worked, so everything else could work. Spain's promise looked like abundance. After the conquests in the Americas, Spanish galleons hauled unimaginable quantities of silver across the Atlantic. In 1545, miners opened Cerro Rico in Potosí, a mountain in present-day Bolivia so rich that it seemed inexhaustible. The Spanish 8 real coin, the piece of 8, became the first truly global currency used in Europe, the Americas, and Asia. It was pure, trusted, and available in volume unheard of before. Britain's promise was convertibility. A pound was not just a paper note, it stood for a defined amount of gold. London's financial system became the clearinghouse of the world. If you held sterling, you held a key that fit every lock in global trade. For over a century before the First World War, this gold-anchored system provided stability and made Britain the heart of commerce. At this first stage, money is a map people believe in. It is scarce enough to hold value and standardized enough to simplify life. That trust is power. It lets governments borrow cheaply, project influence, and build. Stage 2, overextension. Empire carries hidden costs. Each border outpost needs supplies. Each trade route needs protection. Each new promise to citizens, from pensions to subsidies, becomes a permanent line on the ledger. Rome's legions guarded frontiers thousands of miles long. Spain fought on multiple fronts, religious wars in Europe, conflicts on the seas, rebellions at home and in the colonies. Britain's navy patrolled the world, and its administrators oversaw territories on every inhabited continent. On maps, this looks like reach. In budgets, it looks like weight. What starts as temporary spending becomes structural. The list of must-pay bills grows whether the economy is booming or not. Stage 3, deficits. Deficits are the bridge between ambition and ability. Used sparingly, they buy time. Used habitually, they signal denial. Rome's tax system strained to meet obligations as the empire matured. Emperors discovered that raising taxes too high risked revolt, and cutting promises risked unrest. The easiest route was to paper over the gap, at first with borrowing, then with something else. Spain offers a blunt lesson. Even with fleets of treasure ships arriving, the crown spent more than it earned. Wars are relentless drains. Royal courts are expensive. The new wealth fed an appetite that kept growing. Kings issued debt to cover the difference and leaned on bankers to keep the machine running. When the sums stopped adding up, Spain did something monarchies had done before and would do again. It defaulted. In 1557, and again later in the century, the crown suspended payments and forced creditors into restructurings. Each episode repaired the books for a moment and damaged trust for years. Britain took a more sophisticated path, issuing bonds to fund wars, infrastructure, and administration, and it worked as long as sterling stayed strong. But debt piled up as the 20th century opened. The First World War exploded the numbers. A government that had managed debts for centuries suddenly faced a mountain that would define its policy choices for decades. Deficits are politics borrowing from arithmetic. Arithmetic always collects. Stage 4, monetary dilution. When taxing more is politically impossible and borrowing more is financially risky, the money itself changes. Rome did not announce a crisis. It made a series of quiet adjustments that, over time, completely altered the character of its coinage. The denarius, that had once been nearly pure silver, gradually lost metal content. Under various emperors, especially during the 3rd century's turmoil, the silver in everyday coins shrank dramatically. By the time of the Emperor Gallienus, many coins had only a thin wash of silver over a base metal core. To the eye, the coin looked similar. In purchasing power, it was not. Spain's issue was not debasing the coin, it was flooding Europe with money. The 16th century, price revolution, saw prices rise across the continent as the supply of silver outpaced the supply of goods. Spain imported silver and exported its purchasing power, with a further twist in later years, as copper coinage, vellon, was used more widely, aggravating inflation. A flood of money without a flood of productivity erodes value, even if the coin's official purity remains. Britain's turning point came with crisis. In 1914, to finance a total war, the government suspended the promise to turn notes into gold on demand. After the war, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill, tried to put the pound back on gold at the pre-war parity in 1925. The economy, battered and changed by war, could not sustain that old price. British exports struggled. Unemployment stayed high. In 1931, the pound left gold again, this time without a quick return. Later, devaluations in 1949 and 1967 admitted what markets already believed. Yesterday, S-pound was not today S-pound. Monetary change is the pivot of the cycle. It may be done quietly in the mint, dramatically in a speech, or gradually through extraordinary policies. However it appears, the message is the same. The unit you save in now buys less later. Stage 5. Inflation. Inflation is how populations feel monetary change. It's not an abstract statistic. It's the shrinking of what your income can do. Rome's soldiers demanded pay in more reliable forms. Farmers preferred barter or gold. Basic goods required multiples of the coins that used to buy them. The map of prices changed faster than wages could keep up. In Spain, inflation traveled along trade routes. Prices rose for staples across Europe as silver became more abundant. Spanish society found itself on a treadmill, running harder to stand still, while industries in the Netherlands and England gained from selling goods to a Spain flush with money, but lean in domestic production. For Britain, the 1970s burned the lesson into living memory. Inflation surged to double-digit levels, savings were eroded, strikes and political turmoil followed. Managing inflation required years of hard policy choices and a willingness to accept short-term pain to reset expectations. Inflation is the fire alarm. It tells households something is wrong underneath the floorboards. It can abate, and often does, but the level shift in prices remains long after the rate cools. Stage 6, loss of confidence. Confidence is the silent pillar that holds a currency up. When it cracks, systems can still function, but everything gets harder. Roman garrisons that once accepted standard pay began to insist on harder money or goods in kind. Spanish kings found lenders less willing, terms harsher, and trust thinner after repeated defaults. In the 20th century, governments and businesses around the world moved contracts and savings out of sterling and into dollars. Not all at once, not with a single announcement. Confidence erodes slowly, then faster. This is the stage most people miss because, on the surface, life goes on. Stores open, salaries land, markets trade. But underneath, large holders diversify. Contracts are written differently. The scaffolding changes shape. Stage 7. Reset and decline. Decline doesn't always mean disaster. Rome did not disappear the day a barbarian general deposed the last Western emperor. It fragmented, reformed, and parts of it endured in different ways. Spain did not vanish. It ceded primacy and adjusted to a smaller role. Britain remained a wealthy nation with deep institutions. It simply no longer ran the world's monetary table. What matters is the step down. The leading currency shares space or gives way. The empire trims commitments or has them trimmed by events. It adjusts if it can and suffers if it cannot. With those stages in mind, let's tell the three stories properly. Rome, from silver, promise to price spiral. Rome's greatness rested on credible money and predictable law. The denarius worked because people trusted the metal. For centuries, the mint's standards held, and that stability financed expansion. But empire is a teacher of bad habits. When revenues lagged and costs rose, because legions must be fed, roads repaired, and administrators paid, emperors reached for the nearest lever. The first significant reductions in silver were modest, the kind of change technocrats swear is manageable. But the 3rd century brought stress upon stress, internal power struggles, border threats, and disease. In that turmoil, the coinage deteriorated quickly. New denominations like the Antoninianus added complexity, and the actual silver in circulation shrank. A coin bearing the emperor's face could have very little precious metal left. Prices responded. The same sack of grain required many more coins. If you had savings, they dissolved quietly. If you were paid a fixed wage, it lost force. The state tried to fix the symptom with edicts, famously attempting to cap prices under the Emperor Diocletian. But you cannot legislate the value of money back into existence once trust is gone. The economy adapted in ways that hurt the state, its ability to function. Taxes collected in kind rather than coin. Soldiers paid with goods. Local authorities improvising to keep order. Rome's borders did not fail because a rival built a better spear. They failed because the state's money system, and therefore its capacity to coordinate, had been hollowed out. When the bill for centuries of overreach came due, there was not enough trust left in the coins to pay it. Spain, a mountain of silver and a vanishing advantage. Spain's 16th century wealth was dazzling. Galleons arrived stacked with silver bars, and the crown's treasuries filled. It's easy to mistake that for durable prosperity, but money is only wealth if it connects to productive capacity. Spain used its windfall to buy what others made and to fight wars that outlasted the revenues. Domestic industries atrophied. The temptation to import rather than build became a trap. The price revolution was the background music. As silver supplies expanded, prices climbed, slowly, persistently, unequally. Spain tried to solve fiscal stress with more borrowing, leaning on networks of financiers in Europe. When obligations could not be met, the crown declared suspensions of payment, what we would now call sovereign defaults, in 1557 and later. Each reset made future borrowing costlier. Confidence eroded. In the 17th century, additional strains appeared. Copper coinage circulated more widely, adding to inflationary pressures. Spain's best and brightest often sought rents, payments tied to the crown, rather than building competitive industries. Other nations learned to manufacture, to finance, and to innovate, selling to Spain the goods it did not produce itself. The empire's far-flung possessions were expensive to defend and manage, and their rebellions and losses signaled what the books already knew. The numbers no longer worked. Spain's story is not that treasure makes you safe. It is that a flood of money cannot substitute for a base of production. If you spend more than you earn and dilute the power of the coin you spend, the aftermath is not a surprise. It is a sequence. Britain, gold, war, and a quiet handover. Britain's ascent was built on trade, finance, and a credible promise about money. You could turn a pound into a defined weight of gold. That made contracts simple and credit cheap. The City of London became the world's nerve center. Governments and businesses kept accounts in sterling and settled through London. World War I jarred the system. To finance the war, the government broke the conversion link. After the war, leaders tried to restore the old order by returning to gold at the pre-war parity. The gesture meant stability on paper, but it put a heavy weight on a changed economy. Exports were too expensive. Growth lagged. Unemployment bit deep. In 1931, faced with crisis, Britain let the pound float free. Some relief followed, but a new hierarchy had already begun to form. World War II finished the handover that had started in the First. Britain shouldered staggering costs to defeat Nazi Germany. It emerged heroic and exhausted, with debt towering over its economy. At Bretton Woods in 1944, countries agreed to a new system built around the U.S. dollar, still tied to gold, and the pound took second place. Post-war attempts to make the pound fully convertible led to a rapid run on reserves in 1947. Devaluations in 1949 and 1967 acknowledged that sterling RS old value could not be maintained. The 1956 Suez Crisis revealed limits on British power that markets had already priced in. By 1976, a loan from the International Monetary Fund symbolized how far the old leader had stepped down. Britain did not collapse into chaos. It restructured, reformed, and adapted. But it no longer set the terms of the world's money. The decline was not a single event. It was a long sequence, each move narrowing the choices available for the next. Now we turn to the present, the United States. The post-war order put the dollar at the center. For a generation, the U.S. promised to exchange dollars for gold at a fixed price, and others linked to the dollar. The system gave countries a stable anchor and gave the U.S. enormous influence. In 1971, facing a world of rising claims and finite gold, the U.S. ended that convertibility. The dollar became a pure promise, buttressed by the scale of the American economy, the rule of law, and deep financial markets. Oil priced in dollars reinforced global demand for the currency. Over the last several decades, U.S. deficits have become a feature rather than a wartime exception. Debt has grown faster than the economy in many periods. The central bank's balance sheet has expanded in episodes designed to stabilize crises, adding a new layer to the monetary stack. During the pandemic shock of 2020, extraordinary measures created trillions in new money and credit to prevent a freeze. The response avoided an immediate disaster and raised long-term questions familiar to students of the past. Inflation rose sharply in 2021 and 2022, peaking at levels last seen decades ago before easing. Prices sit at a new plateau. The rate of climb has slowed, but few prices have returned to where they began. Abroad, central banks still hold dollars as their first choice, but the share has drifted lower since the turn of the century. Some trade is settling in other currencies at the margins. Nations are building alternative payment channels and adding gold to reserves. None of this dethrones the dollar today. All of it sketches a future where the dollar shares space rather than owning it outright. Let's score the United States, stage by stage. Dominance, active. The dollar remains the primary reserve and invoicing currency. U.S. capital markets are deeper and more liquid than any rivals. Contracts written under U.S. law carry weight. The network effects of this system are real. They give the U.S. room to make mistakes that would sink smaller nations. Overextension, partially active. The U.S. maintains extensive military commitments and a far-reaching domestic safety net. Defense spending is high in absolute terms and stable as a share of the economy. Entitlement programs, promises to citizens, grow automatically. Together, these commitments are hard to trim and easy to expand. They make deficits sticky, deficits active. The federal government has run large deficits through expansions and recessions. In some years, the gap between what the government spends and what it collects has exceeded $1 trillion even when unemployment is low. Interest costs on existing debt are rising as older, cheaper obligations roll into higher rates. Debt compound interest is a hard teacher. It eats budget space quietly and quickly. Monetary dilution, active. Since 2008, the central bank has responded to crises by creating bank reserves and purchasing assets at unprecedented scale. These policies stabilized financial markets and, in the pandemic, helped prevent a depression-level collapse. But they also swelled the stock of dollar claims in the system. While the link from central bank actions to street-level prices is complex, the direction of travel is familiar to anyone who has watched past empires meet repeated emergencies with extraordinary money. Inflation, recently active, now moderated. Consumer prices jumped. They have slowed but remain elevated relative to the pre-2020 trend. Wages rose as well, but the relationship between what people earn and what essentials cost is tense for many households. If you measure inflation by the lived experience of rent, food, energy, and healthcare, the pressure is still very present even as the official rate cools. Loss of confidence emerging. The dollar, U.S. share of global reserves, has declined from roughly 7/10 around the turn of the century to closer to 3/5 today. More trade partners experiment with settling in local currencies or in blends. Central banks have increased gold holdings. Sanctions policy has reminded nations that their dollar assets live inside a system with rules they do not control, nudging some to diversify. None of this is a stampede. It is a steady walk toward optionality. Reset and decline, not yet. The U.S. still enjoys advantages no prior empire had to the same degree. A continental market, energy resources, global-scale technology firms, universities, and the rule of law that attracts capital. These moats do not repeal arithmetic. They buy time. What we do at that time decides the slope of the path ahead. So what happens next? History suggests 3 broad outcomes. First, the managed reset. In this path, the system bends but does not break. The government gradually aligns spending with revenue. Inflation runs above target for a while, quietly reducing the real value of past debts. Growth policies focus on supply, more housing, energy, infrastructure, and productivity, so prices can cool without crushing demand. The dollar remains central but shares space with other currencies where it makes sense. Living standards pause, adjust, and then resume climbing at a more modest pace. It's not fun, it's survivable. Second, the hard break. A financial shock, geopolitical surprise, or political crisis forces abrupt change. Inflation flares anew or growth stalls into recession while prices remain high. Bond markets demand a premium to hold U.S. debt. Confidence stumbles. Policymakers react late or in conflict, and the system lurches. This path is short, violent, and unpredictable. Many decisions are made for you by the pace of events. Third, reform before crisis. Leaders level with the public. Promises are reprioritized and, where necessary, rewritten in ways that protect the vulnerable and focus resources on growth. The monetary framework is clarified and made more rule-like. This path is politically difficult because it asks for trade-offs, and trade-offs do not poll well. Boring policy is often the bravest kind. How would you know which way we're going? Watch a handful of signals. The size and persistence of deficits outside of recession tells you whether discipline is returning. The share of the budget consumed by interest payments tells you how much room remains to maneuver. The behavior of long-term interest rates tells you what lenders believe about inflation and solvency. The dollar's share of global reserves tells you how other nations are hedging. And the gap between wage growth and the cost of essentials tells you how the public will experience whatever happens. A fair objection deserves to be heard. The U.S. is not Rome, Spain, or Britain. It is larger, more innovative, and better at absorbing shocks. It is the world's reserve currency in a time when global finance is far more integrated than in any prior era. All true. Those facts make the path different and buy time. They do not create a loophole in arithmetic. There's another fair point. Inflation has eased from its peak. That is good news. It shows that policy still has tools that work and that expectations can be anchored with serious effort. But easing is not erasing. Prices that jump do not jump back down. The question is whether we use this moment to rebuild credibility or coast into complacency. What can a country do? Spend on what raises productive capacity, energy, logistics, education tied to skills, research that turns into jobs, align immigration with economic goals, reform permitting so building is possible again, make the tax code simpler so capital and talent can see a reason to commit for a decade, tell the truth about long-term promises and adjust them gently now rather than brutally later, commit to a monetary framework that prizes stability and clarity. What can individuals do while the big wheels turn? Understand the system you live in. Know what you own and why. Pay attention to the difference between what something costs and what it's worth. Keep some margin in your life. Cash buffers, skills you can sell, relationships that help in storms. Avoid panic. Panic is expensive. Patience is profitable. Let's close the circle with the 3 case studies because they aren't just history. They are warnings wrapped in stories. Rome's mistake was pretending that a thinner coin was the same coin. For a while you can paint over rot, and a wall will look fine. Then one day you lean on it and it gives. Spain's mistake was confusing a river of silver with a river of wealth. Money is a claim on goods and services. If you neglect the things money is supposed to buy, skills, factories, ships, ideas, the claims become emptier over time. Britannia's mistake was promising an old gold price to a new economy and then clinging to status too long. Pride delayed adjustment, and delay made the eventual step down harder than it had to be. The United States does not have to repeat those mistakes. It has the luxury of time they lacked and tools they didn't invent yet. It can choose boring competence over dramatic denial. It can treat money not as magic, but as measurement, not as fuel, but as a map. That choice will never trend on social media. It will work. The 7 stages are not prophecy. They are a checklist. Right now, the United States is clearly in dominance. Overextension is present. Deficits are chronic. Monetary dilution has been used repeatedly. Inflation has flared and eased, and a cautious diversification away from the dollar has begun at the margins. The final stage is not here. The path to it is not inevitable. The speed and pain of any reset depend on decisions made before the audience notices there's a problem. If you've stayed with me this far, you can now see the pattern. You'll recognize it when a headline tries to distract you with noise. And you'll know what to watch next: the honesty of our budgets, the discipline of our money, and the courage to make steady, unglamorous choices that compound. In the next episode, I'll trace the rise and quiet transformation of the petrodollar, the deal that supported the dollar AS reach after 1971, what replaced it piece by piece, and why energy pricing is the hidden lever nations fight over without ever saying its name. Until then, remember, the pattern doesn't care about slogans. It follows the math. And for now, we still choose the math.